All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Hopefully it's going to be useful for you. Do let me know if you can't hear or anything like that. And if you have questions as well, very keen to hear questions. Mainly the way that this is going to work now is I'm going to walk you through some code. And this is what we're going to be building. As you can see, it's a contact form. And when you click into it, you get these underlines that come through, and then you have this kind of button with this kind of swirling background. So that's kind of what we're going to be focusing in on. I am recording this, so you can watch it back later if you'd like to. But let's get started, and hopefully we'll end up with this by the end of the webinar. All right. I'm going to stop my video there. Oh, okay. Let's get started with our form. Sorry, just give me a second. Great. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a form element. Just make sure everyone can hear me, right? Maybe just drop that you can hear me there in the chat if you don't mind. Great, thank you. Perfect. Great, thanks for that. Okay, so we have a black body, so we'll just have background set to black. I'm just going to set a font family here of Open Sans, set Verdana, sans serif as backups. Just something to note about this session is that some of you will be in second year, some of you will be in first year, some of you will know HTML and CSS. So I might explain things which you already know, but hopefully it's all still helpful and useful for you. Okay. The next thing is the form. I'm going to set a max width of, let's say, 300 pixels, background of white, and I'm going to set it to margin 0 auto. Okay. Can't really see anything on the page yet because there's nothing inside my form. The first thing I can do is I can create an H1 that says contact form, lovely name for a H1, and then we can see it's coming through onto the page. The next thing we can do is we can have an input of type is text, and I'm going to set it to have an ID of name and a class of input. Then I have a label. So label attaches itself to an input using its ID. So I use this ID here, name. So this is the username. I mean, I could call this username and have the ID of username there, kind of, but it joins them together. And so I'm going to have this label. Okay, so we've got that label there. Let me just add some padding here. 50 pixels. Okay, so what we had in the original version, which I can just bring in here quickly, is that we have this name which gets smaller when this is clicked on. And it's not a placeholder. I'm not using the placeholder value, which you might know about, which looks like this. Placeholder, usually it's like an example, like there's Bob Smith, and you see, oh, okay, so that's where I write a name. But we're not using the placeholder. What we're actually doing is we're placing the label using positioning, and we're placing it on top of this input. And to do that, what I do is I'm going to have a div. And I'm going to set the div to have a class of, I'm going to call it input container. And I'm going to place this input and label inside of that. Okay. And now what I can do is I can set my input container to have a position of relative. And it's important to note that when you want to position something absolute, that you need to ensure that the parent element has a positioning set on it. And in this case, I just wanted to have position relative. What that will allow me to do is it'll allow me to move this name label, and I'll be able to position it on top of this input. Okay. So let's do that. Let's have a class here of label. And we can set it to position absolute, and we want it 0 pixels off the top and 0 pixels off the left. And you'll see that it's now placed my label inside of this input. Now I'd like to add a little bit of styling to my input. I'm going to set it to have a width of 100% and a height of 50 pixels. And I think that's enough styling for now. So now I can type in here, and that's great. So my the input is working there. But what I want is I want that when a user clicks into here, that I want this font size of this label to get smaller. So let's see how we can do that. So what we can do is we can say that when input has focus, so focus is when the user is clicking and working in that input. So when the input has focus, then I want the label to have the following styling, and I want it to have font size of, let's say, 13 pixels. So now when we click in, it changes the size of that label, but it's not quite transitioning very nicely. And so what we can do is we can add that we want the properties to transition. I want it to take 1 second to transition. And I could set it to just say font size, but I can also just say all, so that anything that changes does so incrementally. Okay, so now when I click, you can see how it expands and subtracts if it's in focus. Okay, so that's the one little element there that we were wanting. The other thing that we were wanting to have happen is we wanted there to be an underline which appears at the bottom of this input. To do that, what I can do is I can say that I want my label. I can set the pseudo elements of after, and what I can do here is I can add content. So I could say, right, and that appears added via CSS onto my page. It gets added after the label element. Yeah, but I don't really want blah blah appearing on my page. What I want is an underline. And it's important to understand we can't just animate those borders. That's why we have to create these little elements to work with. And so what I want is I would like this element to have a to be positioned, and I'm going to set it to be position absolute. And again, because this is inside input container, which is set to position relative, it takes its positioning based on that. So what I can now say is that I want it to have a top of 50 pixels because I know that the height of this input is 50 pixels. So I want it to be 50 pixels off the top. And let me quickly set it to have a width of 100%. And let's have a background of red for now. And we can set a height of 5 pixels. Okay, we get an element there. You can see that red appearing on the page. It's not exactly what we want. We want it to be on the left-hand side for one. So there it's now on the left. And what I actually want is I don't just want something to appear. And you can see there it's the size of the label that expands and subtracts with the size of that label. What I actually want is I want it to expand and subtract on focus. So what I can do is I can, again, just set a transition. I want this to transition. Again, I can just use transition 1 second all. And I can say that when the input is in focus, the label after should gain a width of 100%. And I'm going to start it at 0%. So starting off, it has 0%. And it grows to the size of the input. But now it's not quite what I want because I don't want it to just be the size of that. So let me quickly see what I've done that I have not done that. The label needs a width of 100% because currently it's only taking up the space of the label itself. And so now whenever I hover in, it expands from 0% to 100%, right? I mean, I could have this at, say, 50% width by default, and then it just expands and goes back down from that. But I just wanted to appear out of kind of nowhere. So I'm going to start it at 0%. All right, hopefully you're keeping track of what's going on here. But basically what I've done is I've created an element that I've now positioned at the bottom of this container. And that now when a user clicks into it, it expands from a width of 0% to a width of 100%. Okay, I'm going to quickly add, I'm going to take away this border here because I don't like that border on my inputs. So I can just set border 0 pixels and maybe add a background of a gray. Okay. And I can see that there's also this thing that when it's in focus, you can see that it gets this outline and it's called outline. And so what I can do is I can say that when it's in focus, outline none. So now when I click into it, it expands and it goes back. You will notice though that if I fill this in, then when I leave, this name label goes back to its normal size. One option for solving that would be that if input is valid, then actually I want this to be on the label class, not just all labels. That when it's valid, then it can just stay. So I'm going to set this to be a required element. And you'll see now, if I fill that in, then the name doesn't come back. All right. So that's kind of solving one of the things that we're wanting to do. We'll get back to the linear gradient on this background in a bit, but at least now we have this kind of expanding and subtracting thing whenever it's on focus. The next thing that I'd like to work on is I can just duplicate this and make it for email. And type of email, and right, and then just quickly add on this input container it's a margin of 20 pixels top and bottom and 0 pixels. I mean, yeah, 20 pixels top and bottom, 0 pixels on the side. And we'll just change that label to email. Okay, so now when you click into each one, they just expand and subtract. The next thing that I want to focus on is my button. So let's have a quick look at how we can do that. So here, let's create a div, and I'm going to create a button container. And inside of my button container, I'm going to have a button element. And I'm going to say submit. So there's my button that's created. Not the most exciting of styling. So let's try and see how we can give that some more interesting styling. What I am going to do as well is I'm going to add something called a div class, and I'm going to call it button background. And it's this div that I'm going to animate to swirl around behind this input. Okay. So to do that, let's go down here and we'll say button background. And here I'm going to just for now set a background of red. I'm going to set a height of 500 pixels and a width of 500 pixels. Okay. One thing I need to do is, again, I need to set this to be a position relative element, and then I'm going to use this as position absolute, and I'm going to move where it's absolutely positioned around on my form. Okay, so let me quickly say that button container should have position relative. Okay, and then this can be position absolute. So now it's absolutely positioned based on its parent element. So I could set something like top minus 100 pixels. And you can see it shoots up there. Left 200 pixels. You can see how it moves around. Okay. I'm going to start it off at top of 0 pixels like that. And what I want to do is I want to create an animation which moves this background around. Okay, so I'm going to create an animation, spell it correctly, and I'm going to call my animation move gradient. We haven't created the gradient yet, but we will get there. And I'm going to set it to be linear, and I want it to go back and forth. So I'm going to say alternate, and I want it to run indefinitely while the user's on this page. This animation should be running. So I'll say infinite. Okay. And now what I can do is I say at keyframes and say move gradient. That's the name of the animation. And at 0%, I want it to have a top of 0 pixels. Then let's say at 100%, I want it to have a left of minus 400 pixels and a top of minus 400 pixels. And clearly I've not done something here. Maybe I had a typo. Yes, there we are. Infinite, misspelled. Okay. So I want to also, actually I'll just set here that the left should be 0 pixels. And if there's a typo there. And what I now have is I have this red block which moves diagonally back and forth. Now it's not hanging around in the background, and we'll get to how we fix that. Thanks. Yeah, see, oh, there we are. Some people were saying that I misspelled. And so now it's moving back and forth here. What I need is a linear gradient, and because I don't quite want to work one out myself, I'm using this site here, CSS gradient, and here you can choose different gradients, whatever you like. I'm going to go with this kind of red purple one here, which looks quite nice. So I'm going to grab that code. And I mean, I can play around with this a little bit to make it our own. And it kind of updates whatever, if I wanted it to be more purple or something, I don't know. And then it'll update this. So I can copy that to clipboard. And I can change this background from having just a background of red. We can now have this linear gradient background. Now, an issue that we have is that obviously it's on top of our button, and what we want it to be is the kind of the background of our button. So one thing we can do there is that we can set the button container to have, sorry, let me just double check. I want the button container, yep, to have an overflow hidden, right? So there shouldn't be anything outside of my button container. And now you can see my button container is changing. It's not quite changing how I want it to. And so what I can do there is I can set a, let's say, a max width of 100 pixels. So now it's staying the same size, and you can see that kind of background swirling around behind us there. One problem is that our button isn't appearing, so we need to deal with that. And to do that, we can set our button to have position relative, and we can then use a Z index to make our button appear. So there, our button is now on top. We now need to set it to not have a background. So there we can now see that swirling background. Set it to have a width of 100%. Let's have no border. And let's make sure it's got a height of 100% of the container. I want it to have a color of white because just looks a little bit better on that kind of darker background. And then I want a border radius. Let's add the border radius here. So we can have a border radius of, let's say, 20 pixels. So that just gives it that kind of those rounded edges. And then it's inside my button, we can add some padding of, let's say, 20 pixels. Oh, that's a bit much. That looks better. And maybe what we can also do here is just add a font weight. Okay. So now we have our swirling button, and we have our inputs that change. We could add something here onto the button because there's nothing happens when you go onto the button. So to just add a little bit extra, we could look at button hover, And we could say that we want some text decoration there. Sorry, I'm missing some question. What does Z index do? There we are. There's good answers there already. Sorry, I missed that question. Yeah, so what does Z index do? It brings it to the top. So if I had to, and it has to be on a positioned element. So for example, let's have a look here. If I had to take off this relative positioning, my button would disappear. So I need that. And basically what happens is it decides a score. So if there's an element with a Z index of 100 and another element with a Z index of say 101, it would put the one with 101 higher up. So I just chose 100. You could choose another number there, but kind of the same thing will apply. So I mean, I could put this to be 10, I guess, and then it'll still appear because there's no other element fighting for it in terms of hierarchy. Okay, so that's most of what I wanted to cover. The only other thing really was that I set an animation on the form itself. So I created an animation here and we could call it fly in. I think that sounds like a good name. So say 1 second, ease in, and I'm going to call the animation fly in. And I want it to stay. Once it's come in, I want it to stay. And that's why I use the term forwards, so that going forwards after this animation is run, just keep it there. And what I'm going to do is I will set this form to have position relative, and I'll set it to have a in my keyframes here. Sorry, there we are. Keyframes. And again, I use the name. So use the keyframes first. Is this design responsive? Does it work on multiple screen sizes? We can have a look. Let me just get through this bit and then we can have a look at the responsiveness. It should scale fine. I mean, I've got a max width of 300 pixels, so that's below most screen sizes anyway, but we can have a look at that. So the fly in keyframes, and I want it at 0% to have a top of minus 400 pixels. And once it's finished running at 100%, I want it to have a top of 0 pixels. So say top 0 pixels. And now it drops into the page. You could, for your own amusement, add in a little bounce here. So how you could do that is you could have at 95% that it goes back up to a top of minus 30 pixels, right? So then now when it drops down, kind of gives that little bounce. Right? If you like that, then you can keep that. But otherwise, that will just drop it down straight onto the page like that. Okay. And then if you click that, let's have a look. There was a question about responsiveness. So let's go to that side actually. And you can see that at lower screen sizes, it just starts to scale. Maybe we want to write a media query here to reduce the height of that block. But you can see that the reason that it's scaling is that I have this on my label. I have width of 100% and my input as well has a width of 100%. So if I had to have set my width to be 500 pixels or something like that. Okay, so right, so there maybe okay on some slightly bigger screens, but you can see you start running into problems and it creates a horizontal scroll bar there. So that's why I don't want to use a pixel width there. I want to use a percentage width. So then, as you can see, when it starts getting pressed, it scales. Okay. All right. I think we have about 10 minutes left in the session. Are there any questions that I can answer or questions that I've missed perhaps in the chat? Yeah, I can share the code pane. That's no problem. Yeah, definitely can share the code pane, and this will be recorded as well in case I went through it too quickly. So it's quite a bit of code to cover. So I hope that people were able to at least get a few ideas. Like one nice thing is just seeing the positioning of things, and also realizing that CSS there's a bit of kind of fudging. That adding something like this background, the swirling background, like there's no CSS property swirling background. You have to kind of fudge it a bit. So that's probably something to know, as well as like adding elements to the page, like using after. Yeah, look, I mean, there's probably the color is a bit too light. I mean, I could drop this yellow to a little bit darker. Maybe that's, I don't know. Could try that. Let's see if that looks better in terms of WCAG. Doesn't look quite as nice now. Is there can we use CSS gradients in our semester project? Yeah, you're very welcome to. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, this is just a linear gradient, and you're very welcome to use this CSS gradient site. In terms of things like plagiarism, like writing this, I mean, you can do it yourself. That's fine. But I don't mind if you had to use a site like this to help you along. It's more like if you just had to come across and just like copy this code and paste it into your project, then that's kind of where we're looking at in terms of issues. Is there any other questions? Good question. So on our course, we're not too concerned about IE. I think we, at least my previous experience has always been quite negative with IE. You are a bit restricted. I mean, it's why things like here on CSS gradients, it gives you like a background, like in case the browser doesn't handle linear gradients. So yeah, so there's going to be some older versions of IE that won't be compatible with these sorts of things. And then for them, well, they just don't see the animation. But that's okay. We kind of want to design for most users, and most users are using Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and yeah, like you can't just hold your web dev back because we need to support IE. At least that's and there, yes, can I use is very useful. So definitely do check them out. Can the name inside the input disappear from the user click? Yeah, so I showed that a bit earlier. So if you have placeholder here, so could have kind of placeholder there of Bob Smith, and then if you click into it and start typing, then that disappears. I mean, you could also just have this disappear. You could have this label disappear, but it's kind of part of the design of this form that we would just have the label kind of scale back. Oh yeah, whoops, I didn't apply the gradients. Thank you. So yeah, so we just take that exact background, and instead of applying the, where is it? Instead of applying this background red, we just apply. Thanks for catching that. And there you get the linear gradient coming through. Okay, thanks for catching that. I'm sure there's one or two other things that I've missed, but hopefully you get the gist. It's kind of the main thing that I guess I'm hoping for here is to kind of just inspire you to try different things, and know that CSS is quite broad in its scope and what it can do. So yeah, there's lots possible, and it's not like we've used ridiculous properties or anything like that. I mean, the only thing really is the transitions and the animations. Using animation, is it possible to have a dummy cursor on page load to transition? Yeah, I guess you could have something positioned on the page and then kind of guide the user there. So yeah, definitely. I probably don't have the scope in this tutorial now because our time's coming to a close. But yeah, you could just position something to kind of bounce onto the page or kind of slide to a position. So yeah, so that's definitely possible. Cool. I'm glad that you guys are enjoying the webinar. Hopefully we're going to do more of it. It was good to hear that people wanted webinars. We used to have them per class, and that just became unmanageable. But I think having these sessions, yeah, it's similar to the kind of the fly in, except you're just putting it on a specific other element, not a form element. But yeah, glad to hear you guys have enjoyed the webinar. Yeah, and I think Anders is taking one tomorrow on JavaScript, so you can join him there for that. So yeah. All right. Thanks for joining, everyone, and I think we'll chat soon. And yeah, I'll post the video once I've downloaded and uploaded it. So great. Bye for now.